I want you to listen to something for me. Let's listen to it one more time. From the title of the video and the thumbnail, you probably already know where it's from. Before the 2006 World Cup, Nike started their ad campaign titled simply Joga Bonito, the beautiful game. It featured commercials and ad spots and showcased pure class football. They would have players like Ronaldinho, Ronaldo, Henry, and Zlatan scoring goals, nutmegs, and masterful dribbling exhibitions. While it's clearly a commercialized effort from a giant corporation to sell more football gear, this was different. When you watched one of these commercials, you weren't thinking about buying a new pair of boots with a swoosh on it. You were caught up in the sensation of the beautiful game. It was football in its purest form. Yes, it may have contributed to trophies and being heralded by the world as the best, but at the heart of it was joy, creativity, and respect. During this era, you weren't watching athletes playing football. You were watching magicians making art. But the effectiveness of Nike's Joga Bonito wasn't only rooted in a boardroom full of marketing experts. And surprisingly, it also wasn't from capitalizing on these legendary players. It's much, much deeper than that. This video isn't about the 2006 Nike commercial spectacle. To truly understand Joga Bonito, you have to forget everything you've ever seen in TV ads and highlight reels. You have to go back to a time when Brazil wasn't a footballing nation. It was a colony built on slavery. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, Brazil received nearly 5 million African slaves, more than any other country in the transatlantic slave trade. Sugar, coffee, gold. These industries thrived on the backs of enslaved people, many of whom were taken from regions in West and Central Africa where games involving a ball were already part of local culture. The roots of what we now call football weren't foreign to them. But in Brazil, the rules were different. They were stripped of their names, their languages, their traditions, everything. Expression was dangerous. Drumming and dancing were often banned because colonial powers feared these could be used to organize revolts. Yet, even under these oppressive conditions, they found a way to express themselves. When they couldn't dance, they moved with the ball. When they couldn't drum, they made rhythm with their steps. The early versions of their play didn't follow rules. There were no referees, no goals, just space, bodies, and movement, an outlet for pain, a disguise for joy. This style wasn't about winning or scoring. It was about survival. It was about creating a sense of identity in a world that had stripped it away. And it was deeply connected to another powerful tradition they preserved, capoeira. Capoeira was more than a martial art. It was a dance, a fight, a performance. It was fluid, deceptive, full of feints and body sways. Because it was banned, it too had to be disguised as play. And that instinct to hide resistance and beauty seeped into the way they moved, with rhythm, with flow, with unpredictability. Eventually, these enslaved Africans and their descendants took this instinct into the sport that arrived later, football. When football was introduced to Brazil in the late 1800s by European elites, it was strictly upper class. Black people weren't allowed to play in official clubs, but in the streets and the backyards, away from the watchful eye of institutions, they created their version of the game, one that reflected them, one that was rooted not in British discipline, but in African soul. And that version didn't look anything like the world had ever seen. It was improvisational, it was spontaneous, it was expressive. It wasn't just football, it was performance, it was freedom. And though they didn't have a name for it at first, what they were doing was the earliest expression of what the world would later call Joga Bonito. So when we say the beautiful game was born in Brazil, that's only half true. It was born in the resilience of Africans, nurtured through centuries of oppression and carried by generations who used creativity as a weapon against control. Joga Bonito wasn't born on grass. It was born in dirt, and it grew in the cracks of a broken system. But over the years, it was later seen as something far more refined, no longer just an act of survival or rebellion, but a recognizable style of play that set Brazil apart from the rest of the world. As football began to evolve and organize itself under official rules and structures, the raw street football once played in the shadows by enslaved Africans and their descendants began to be acknowledged as something more, a philosophy rooted in movement, rhythm, and joy. That philosophy would come to be known as Joga Bonito. Translated from Portuguese, Joga Bonito means play beautifully, but the true essence of it goes far beyond that simple definition. It isn't merely about flair or dazzling skills. It's a celebration of creativity, spontaneity, and expression in a game often reduced to numbers, tactics, and results. While European football emphasized discipline, systems, and industrial efficiency, Joga Bonito embraced improvisation, emotion, and the artistry of the individual. It allowed players to treat the ball not as a tool for victory, but as an extension of their body and soul, something to be danced with, not just controlled. This form of play developed outside formal institutions and often in spaces where joy had to be hidden or disguised, was shaped by the inherited rhythms of the African movement. It drew from capoeira's deceptive motion, from samba's fluidity, and from centuries of cultural resistance where beauty was an act of defiance. Over time, this expression began to seep into mainstream Brazilian football, not because it was taught in academies, but because it lived in the hearts of those who had nothing else but their creativity and a ball at their feet. In neighborhoods where poverty was widespread and opportunity scarce, playing beautifully was often the only currency that mattered. It was not just about winning, it was about how you played the game, how much you could move people, how much joy you could create in a moment. A nutmeg wasn't just a trick, it was a statement. A back heel wasn't for show, it was part of a language. And that language became synonymous with Brazil, even as the world tried to turn football into a sport of systems and calculations. What made Joga Bonito endure wasn't just its flair or spectacle, but the fact that it had soul. It was emotional, unpredictable, and deeply rooted in a history most of the world didn't fully understand. While it took generations for this style to be recognized on the world stage, eventually it would gain a face. And that face would belong to a teenager from a small town in Brazil who played with elegance, humility, and a kind of beauty that couldn't be taught in any academy. Because while Joga Bonito was born from the struggles of the forgotten, it would take a boy named Pele to show the world how beautiful it could be. Pele was not the inventor of Joga Bonito, but he was the first to carry it onto the global stage with such brilliance that the world could no longer look away. By the time he was just 17 years old, he had already become a symbol of something new. Not just a young, gifted footballer, but a living embodiment of a style that defied the structure and rigidity dominating European football at the time. Through Pele, Joga Bonito finally had a vessel that the international game could not ignore. Born Edson Arantes de Nascimento in the modest town of Três Corações, Pele grew up playing with improvised balls on the dusty streets of Bauru. What separated him from his peers wasn't just his technical ability or speed, it was his relationship with the ball. He moved with a fluidity that was entirely natural, seemingly uncoached, as if every feint and flick came from something deeper than training. What Pele carried onto the pitch was more than talent, it was cultural memory passed down through generations who had been denied the right to express themselves, now finding expression in him. At the 1958 World Cup in Sweden, Pele didn't just perform, he introduced the world to a new interpretation of football. He scored 6 goals in the tournament, including a hat-trick in the semi-final and 2 more in the final against the hosts. But it wasn't the number of goals that stunned audiences, it was the manner in which he scored them. Each touch was elegant, each move unpredictable, and each moment seemed to flow with a rhythm that went beyond tactical execution. This wasn't just effective football, it was beautiful football. International commentators and football analysts tried to describe what they were seeing, but their frameworks lacked the vocabulary to capture it. They called it instinct, magic, even improvisation, but in Brazil, it already had a name, Joga Bonito. Pele had not created the style, but he had brought it out of the streets, off the dirt pitches, and into the stadiums of the world, where millions could finally witness what had lived in the margins for so long. What made Pele so important in this transition wasn't just his success, though he would go on to win 3 World Cups and score over 1,000 goals. It was that he achieved all of it without compromising the essence of Joga Bonito. He played with joy, humility, and freedom that made even the most competitive matches feel like expressions of art. He didn't sacrifice creativity for control. Instead, he elevated creativity to the level of dominance. In doing so, Pele became a national icon, but also a cultural bridge. He showed the world that football could be more than results and titles. It could be beautiful and joyful without losing its effectiveness. More importantly, he showed the Brazilian people, especially Afro-Brazilians, that their way of playing, their heritage, and their style were not only valid but worthy of global admiration. After Pelé, the world no longer viewed Brazilian football as a copy of the European model. It was something unique, something with its rhythm and philosophy. And from that moment on, Joga Bonito was no longer confined to the streets where it was born. It had been given a stage, and Pelé had drawn back the curtain. Pelé had taken Joga Bonito from the streets to the world stage, but as football entered the global era, that beauty slowly began to fade. In the decades that followed his rise, football became more structured, tactical, and commercial. European clubs dominated, and the game started to prioritize discipline over creativity. Even in Brazil, pressure to win at all costs led to a more pragmatic style. By the 1994 World Cup, Brazil had become more conservative and more results-driven. The flair was still there, but it was controlled, measured, and often sacrificed for tactical balance. As Brazilian players moved abroad at younger ages, they were molded to fit into rigid systems, often forced to adapt rather than express themselves. The kind of joy and freedom once seen in the streets was being replaced by precision and efficiency. Football had become a business, with television rights, sponsorship deals, and global audiences. The demand for predictable success overshadowed the unpredictable brilliance of Joga Bonito. But just when it seemed like the philosophy was slipping into history, it resurfaced, not through a player or a coach, but through a bold marketing campaign. And strangely enough, the revival began with a Frenchman wearing a suit. But before we talk about that, please click the subscribe button. Thank you. In 2006, Nike launched a campaign that reignited something football had quietly lost: Joga Bonito. The campaign wasn't just about boots or kits, it was a cultural statement. It reminded the world of football's roots in joy, creativity, and expression. At the center of it all was Eric Cantona, a retired French legend known for his charisma and boldness. In the commercials, he wasn't just the narrator, he was a guardian of the game's soul, calling out diving, time-wasting, and robotic play. Play beautiful, he demanded, and millions listened. The campaign showcased players like Ronaldinho, Ronaldo, Cristiano Ronaldo, and Zlatan Ibrahimovic, athletes who played with flair, personality, and joy. But more than their skills, Nike highlighted their freedom. It was a tribute to the spirit that had once defined Brazilian football and street culture. Through ads, videos, and internet clips, a new generation was introduced to the philosophy of Joga Bonito. And for the first time in years, the beauty of the game was once again at the forefront, not just in Brazil, but around the world. Joga Bonito worked because it connected football with something bigger: pop culture. At a time when social media and video platforms were just emerging, Nike delivered a message that fit perfectly into this new digital world. The campaign wasn't just about skill, it was about style, identity, and attitude. Players like Ronaldinho and Cristiano Ronaldo weren't just athletes, they were global icons. Their flair, their charisma, and their freedom on the ball matched the energy of music videos, fashion trends, and youth culture. The visuals were sharp, the soundtrack was bold, and the message was clear. Football could be beautiful, expressive, and personal again. And in an era where the game was becoming more structured and tactical, Joga Bonito offered something refreshing: a return to authenticity. It reminded people why they fell in love with football in the first place. But here's the thing: for all the hype, all the ads, and all the flair, there was one big moment where Joga Bonito was supposed to truly shine: the 2006 World Cup. Brazil came into the tournament stacked. Ronaldinho, Ronaldo, Kaká, Adriano. It was like a dream team assembled to dance through defenses. People expected magic. After all, the world had just watched them juggle tennis balls and do no-look passes on TV. Now it was time to see Joga Bonito come alive on the biggest stage. But it didn't. The spark wasn't there. Brazil looked sluggish, disconnected, like a team trying to live up to an image rather than playing with real joy. Ronaldinho, fresh off a Ballon d'Or win, never found his rhythm, and by the time they faced France in the quarterfinals, it all came crashing down, eliminated by a disciplined, organized side led by Zidane. So, did Joga Bonito fail? Not exactly. What failed was the expectation that style alone could win a tournament. The reality is that World Cups aren't won just with flair, they're won with balance, preparation, and unity. Brazil had the talent, but not the cohesion. But even in defeat, the philosophy didn't disappear. The idea of Joga Bonito had already rooted itself in the minds of a generation. The message was bigger than one tournament. It had sparked something, not just in Brazil, but around the world. And that would matter more in the long run. Even after Brazil's disappointing World Cup in 2006, Joga Bonito didn't just vanish. It evolved, passed on like a torch from one generation to the next. While the result may have fallen short, the influence of Ronaldinho lingered long after the final whistle. Ronaldinho didn't just play football, he inspired. Kids from Sao Paulo to Seoul tried to imitate his elastico, his no-look passes, and his ability to smile while taking on 3 defenders. He made football joyful again, and that feeling didn't fade with Brazil's World Cup exit. It lived on, especially in the next face of Brazilian football, Neymar. Neymar was the perfect heir to the Joga Bonito spirit. From the early clips of him dazzling defenders with Santos to his breakout with the Brazilian national team, his game was built on flair, unpredictability, and imagination. He didn't just dribble past players, he humiliated them, but with style, not spite. What made Neymar stand out wasn't just his talent, but how unapologetically expressive he was. He danced after goals, played with instinct, and carried himself like football was still a street game. And just like Ronaldinho before him, Neymar wasn't afraid to be different. It's exactly what kept the flame alive, refusing to conform to robotic, overly tactical football. Even as global football leaned further into rigid systems, data analysis, and structured roles, Neymar brought chaos, the good kind. He was a reminder that joy is still allowed in football. And whether people loved him or criticized him, they watched, because players like Neymar kept that spirit of Joga Bonito visible and relevant. It wasn't always perfect. Injuries, pressure, and expectations weighed heavily. But stylistically, Neymar stood as a living thread that connected the past, Ronaldinho's golden smile and street swagger, to the present. In a world growing colder and more efficient, Neymar played like it was still fun. And that, right there, is the legacy of Joga Bonito. Because when Neymar carried the spirit of joy and artistry into the modern game, he wasn't just entertaining fans. He was reminding the world what football could be. Not just efficient and tactical, but human, expressive, even poetic. The truth is, Joga Bonito was never just a campaign or a slogan. It was a cultural shift. Before it, football was becoming increasingly about systems, results, and physical dominance. Joga Bonito pushed back against all that. It celebrated the individual within the team. It gave permission to be creative, unpredictable, and bold. You saw it ripple through academies, street pitches, and youth tournaments around the world. Coaches started allowing more freedom. Kids began prioritizing flair and technique. For once, it wasn't just about scoring, it was about how you scored. Even in countries that weren't traditionally known for that kind of expressive play, you could see its influence. From Europe to Asia to Africa, players who grew up watching Ronaldinho and Neymar started bringing their flavor into the game. Football was no longer just a sport, it was becoming an art form again. And it wasn't limited to football. The aesthetic of Joga Bonito, the rhythm, the attitude, bled into music, fashion, and even other sports. Basketball stars like Kobe Bryant referenced it. Street culture embraced it. Social media exploded with freestyle content that followed its ethos. Creativity without restriction. That's the real power of Joga Bonito. It didn't change how football is scored, it changed how football is felt. And long after the campaigns ended and the stars moved on, the philosophy stayed. It lives on in how young players celebrate, and how fans talk about the game, and in how people believe football should be played, with freedom, joy, and soul. Joga Bonito started as something quiet, a way for the enslaved to feel free to express something no chains could suppress. Over centuries, it became a movement, a language without words, a style that turned football into something more than a sport. It influenced legends like Pelé, enchanted the world through Ronaldinho, and lived on through Neymar and beyond. It changed how we see the game, not just about winning, but how you play. That's a powerful legacy, because even if the term fades from commercials or hashtags, the essence of Joga Bonito will always be there, in the kid juggling a ball barefoot on the street, in the player who nutmegs an opponent just because they can, in every smile after a goal. That's what makes Joga Bonito timeless. It's not just a style, it's a spirit. And the game, no matter how much it changes, will always need that. Thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel as this will help us grow.